Modern RCs are complex machines, and performing proper maintenance on them means you'll spend less time fixing them and more time bashing them. And whereas it's important to continue maintaining your car as you use it, the best time to start is when your car is brand new. And in this video, I'm going to share all the maintenance tips and tricks I've learned over the 20 years in this hobby, and I guarantee at the end of this video, you'll know how to save a bunch of money and have more fun with your car. Now, obviously, any new car should come out of the box ready to go, but there are definitely a few things that you'll want to check just to make sure that you're not going to have any problems that might cost you money down the road. The very first thing you'll want to look at is your car body. Depending on what manufacturer you went with, you may need to reinforce the body. This Punisher 4 body is already pretty thick, and these things hold up really well, so there's not really much we need to do here. The only thing I'd really want to do here is if you have some sort of skid, just take a look at the screws inside and make sure they're tight. If you've got a clipless body system, take a look at all the screws and just make sure everything looks like it's attached the way it's supposed to be. The screws on this Punisher 4 look just fine. One thing that's really important that'll end up saving you time and money in the long run are related to the wheels and tires. And that's going to be making sure that your tires are vented and your wheels are sealed. There are a lot of manufacturers that are doing this out of the box now, but not everybody is. I know Traxxas doesn't on a lot of theirs, and Team Corelli isn't either. Let me show you how to do this, and I'll tell you why it's important. What you're going to want is some of this assorted copper tubing that you can get on Amazon. This stuff's actually really good for a lot of different purposes, but this tube right here that's about 4 millimeters in diameter will be perfect for this. What we're going to do is cut a length of this. It's very easy. All you need to do is take a razor blade and roll it back and forth to make a score mark, and then you can just break the tube off. Once you've got that piece cut off, just take that same razor blade and roll it around the inside of the tube to sharpen the end of the tube. It doesn't have to be perfect. That looks just fine. Then just lightly press against the center of the tire and drill your hole. As you can see here, it cuts a perfectly smooth hole. That's why you want to use something like this instead of something like a drill bit. A drill bit or scissors or something like that is going to cut a jagged hole, and that's going to cause it to possibly rip down the road. This hole looks basically exactly like what you see from the manufacturers, and this works really, really well. I like to do 2 or 3 of these around the circumference. And then once you've done that, you want to seal up the holes that are on the inside here. You can use whatever you want to seal these up. You could use glue, but I like to use a good quality electrical tape. This is Scotch electrical tape, and it works very well. I find that cheap electrical tape kind of sucks, and I really don't like using it, and I don't recommend you use it either because it's just going to end up falling off. Now, while I'm sealing these up, let me explain why we're doing this. If you have the holes for venting on the inside, basically that means everything can get into the wheel, but nothing can get out of the wheel. Over time, moisture and debris will get in there, and that's going to cause it to get unbalanced, as well as degrade your foams. Sealing up that hole in the wheel and then venting your tire means anything that gets in there is going to immediately get slung right back out again by centrifugal force, and that's going to make your wheels and tires last a lot longer. There are some people that say just to seal the wheels and not to vent the tires. I personally have found crap still gets in there, so I like venting the tires. And again, most manufacturers are moving to doing this, so I think this really is the best way to go. The only real caveat to this is on belted tires. You really don't want to punch holes in these because you're going to be punching holes through the belts. I'm not sure if it would actually lead to a tire failure, but given how much these things cost, it's probably not something you want to find out. Whether you're going to be venting the tires or not, I recommend taking the wheels off as a very first step when you get your new car, and here's why. These cars are designed to be ready to run out of the box, but they're also very complex mechanical and electronic machines, and there's always a possibility that something may have gotten missed during manufacturing. Taking the wheels and tires off gives you a really good view of everything on the car, and it lets you fix any problems you might see when not only is it the least likely to cost you more money, but the car is never going to be as clean as it is right now. Or is it? We've got some products we're going to be trying in this video that might actually help this thing stay clean and last longer. But before we do any of that, we need to give this thing a really good once-over. You might not want to touch your new car with a single tool before you go out and drive it, but just giving it a good once-over, touching everything, taking a look at all the hinge points, pivot balls, steering, and everything on here, not only will give you an idea if there's any major problems with it out of the box, but it's going to let you know what this thing looked like from brand new condition, which means you're going to have a better chance of seeing if something's wrong in the future. We want to take a close look at the electronics. This Punisher 4 has a spiced up Max 10 SCT ESC, and as you can see, the wiring on it is pretty neat and organized, but you just want to make sure that your ESC isn't flopping around, your power button is secure, it looks like your connector's in good condition. This is an A-mask connector, which is a high quality connector. If you buy a cheaper car and it doesn't have a name brand connector on it, you may actually consider replacing it with a name brand connector because those cheapy connectors can be problematic. We also want to check our motor wires, not only to make sure they're all the way seated, but to make sure they don't come out really easily. If one of these comes loose, it can damage your ESC or motor. Speaking of the motor, we definitely want to do some inspection here, and on this particular car, that means getting rid of this tower. To do that, we just pull this pin and we can flip it up out of the way, and then we want to remove this gear cover. This is going to give us a good look at the spur and pinion gear, and there's a few things you want to check here. The first one is that the motor is mounted solidly. This one feels great. The second one is checking the mesh between the spur and pinion. You want to make sure that you've got a little bit of play between the two gears, but not so much that they feel really loose, and you especially don't want it to be so tight that they're binding, because that's going to cause you problems. With this particular system, there's no adjustment in this motor mount, so what you get is what you're going to have to live with, but this already does feel pretty good. The other thing we want to take a look at is the grub screw on the pinion. There are a few different schools of thought here. Some people say you need to take this out and Loctite it. I think on most cars, just making sure it's good and tight should be sufficient. Most manufacturers are thread locking their pinions from the factory, so usually they don't fall off. Now, while we're here, we also want to take a look at our servo. There isn't a whole lot to do here, but especially on a metal geared servo, you want to make sure that the servo horn screw is also nice and tight. I find these sometimes don't come thread locked properly from the factory, and these screws are fairly common to have back out. Never really had it happen on one of these TC cars, but it does happen. And then the final check you want to do on your electronics is just to make sure the wiring isn't anywhere it's going to get caught up in any of the mechanical moving parts. These Team Corrali cars have really good cable routing, and so they usually stay away from all the moving bits, but I've seen plenty of other cars where the wire is either really close or actually touching something that rotates, and it will wear through those wires eventually and cause you a lot of headache. What we're going to be digging into next might be a little bit controversial because some people think that you don't really need to check these. I personally think it's a great idea to look at them because if you don't, it could end up costing you a lot of time and money in the long run. And right now, it really doesn't take that long. Now, I'm not talking about the shocks, though taking a quick look at them to make sure they're not leaking is a good idea. I'm talking about the differentials. Depending on what car you have, getting to your differentials can range from being fairly simple to fairly complicated. I'd say these TC cars are kind of somewhere in the middle. There are quite a few things you do have to take off, but none of it's terribly difficult to do. And once we get to the differential, there's a few things we're going to be looking for. The very first one is going to be proper external lubrication. This is something that a lot of people tend to go overboard on. The reality is the only lubricant that the gears are actually going to be using is the very light film that's actually on the teeth. Anything beyond that, all that's on the outside, is just kind of a waste and just makes a mess. One thing I've noticed is that a lot of manufacturers tend to use some pretty cheap grease on their gears, and a lot of people tend to recommend grease that I'm not sure I would actually recommend you use. Things like this Mag 1 wheel bearing grease, which is lithium based, red and tacky, and pretty much every other grease you're going to have that comes in a container like this is probably also going to be lithium based, isn't actually safe for plastic. Now, of course, how unsafe for your plastic it is depends on how much you use, how long it's on there, what type you use, and a lot of other factors. But in general, it is not really designed to be in contact with plastic. There are plastic safe greases. I use this Udder Butter from Cow RC. It works really, really well. It's not the cheapest thing in the world, but you get a lot of it. And like I said, when you're greasing gears, you really only need the slightest amount of grease. That's going to spread out through the gear teeth and give it all the lubrication it needs. If you've been using something like this lithium grease on your vehicles and really packing it in there, there's a good chance in a couple of years, it's actually going to end up degrading your plastics and causing problems. So if you're going to be doing something like that, I definitely recommend using something that's designed to be plastic safe. This is also really waterproof, which is nice because if things get wet, and trust me, this thing's gonna be getting wet in this video, we're not gonna lose the grease on those gear teeth. With that being said, the grease that's on the gears isn't really why we take these out and look at them. There's two main maintenance reasons to pull one of these out of a new car. The first one is to see what's inside. Pulling this off, we can see that the fluid in here is just about up to the level of the cross pins in the gears, and that's a pretty decent amount of fluid. There is a bit of a gap down here at the bottom. There's a lot of misconception about how much fluid you actually need in one of these differentials. To lubricate the gears, it's basically the same as the teeth on these gears. You just need enough to wet the teeth, and that's not really that much. Of course, when you're talking about tuning the differential, that changes. If you don't have a lot of fluid in there, it doesn't really matter what type of fluid you're using, it's going to end up being pretty loose. For most people that are just having fun bashing, the amount of fluid that's in here and how thick that fluid is doesn't really matter that much. If you're a racer, consistency is important and tuning's important, but for most bashers, as long as it's got something like 10 or 20,000 weight fluid in it, it's gonna be just fine. In my experience for bashing, running thicker fluid in the front doesn't make a huge amount of difference, though it can make it a little bit harder to turn. However, running thicker fluid in the rear can make it easier to slide, because as weight gets transferred in a turn, if you just have thin fluid, it'll let this wheel spin faster, giving the opposite side wheel more traction, which reduces its ability to slide. Whether Whether or not that's a good thing is up to you. And the reality is, whether you're talking about the front, rear, or center differential, tuning is going to be a very personal thing. I personally like to run really thick fluid in the center diff because that lets it wheelie easier, but it also reduces your ability to turn under acceleration. My recommendation is just to go with what's stock, see how it feels to you, and then play around with the fluid if you feel like you need to. The other thing that we really want to check while we have a differential out is the differential mesh. Manufacturers, especially Team Corrali, have gotten much better at getting gear mesh good from the factory, but it's still worth taking a look at. Basically, with the differential all the way in, we want to make sure that there's a little bit of play between the gears. You can test that by holding the center drive shaft and then wiggling the differential back and forth. As you can see, there's just a tiny bit of play here, but we don't want to have them so close together that they actually bind. This feels really, really good, and if it's a little bit loose or a little bit tight, it's not that big of a deal, but if it's really loose or really tight, you're going to want to shim, and Team Corrali actually makes that relatively easy. As you can see, there's already a couple of shims here on the differential. That's pushing the ring gear toward the pinion gear, so if you needed to make it looser, you could take one of these off and put it on the other side. Unfortunately, you do have to take the differential apart in order to do that, and if you wanted to make it tighter, you could add a little bit more shim here, or if you really needed to and you couldn't add shims here, you could put a shim behind the pinion gear and bring it toward the ring gear. The question here is, do you really need to do all of this to your differentials when you buy a new vehicle? And the answer is maybe. Not only does pulling the differentials out and looking at them give you a good overview of the car and help you get comfortable with how the car is put together, but it will ensure that there aren't any problems out of the box and can really help save you time and money in the long run. Now, there are a lot of people watching this that are going to see what I just did and say, yeah, I'm not going to do all of that before I take my car out for the first time. And that's okay. These are toy cars. It's not a rocket ship that we're sending to the moon with people on it. If you don't do this stuff and you end up having a problem, it's not like it's the end of the world. It just might end up costing you a bit more time and a little bit more money in the long run. Now, we're about to go get this Punisher 4 very, very dirty, but before we do, there's one more thing we need to look at, and that's your owner's manual. This seems like a boring step, but there's a bunch of really good information in here that's going to help you get familiar with your car. And one of the things it's probably going to be able to tell you how to do is set your endpoints on your steering. I'm not going to get into the details of that in this video, but doing so will help save your servo in the long run, and is definitely a good thing to check before you go out the first time. Now, before we take this Punisher 4 out for the first time, I'm going to use this Moose Slick RC silicone protector. This stuff is supposed to stop dirt from sticking as badly and should help keep the car cleaner, but I'm only going to put it on half the car so we can see just how effective it is, and then don't worry, we're going to get this thing very, very dirty. As you can see, I've got half the car masked. Now, the goal of this is just to lightly mist all surfaces on the car. Then you want to let it cure before you actually take it out and bash it. And while I'm doing this, if you're having a good time with this video and learning something, make sure you get subscribed. I've got a lot of really cool stuff coming that you're definitely not going to want to miss. And now we're going to subject this poor car to pretty much the worst conditions in the world, and that is dirty, muddy ground in the rain. We've got leaf litter, sugar sand, branches, mud. It is just an absolute sloppy mess out here. I'm really curious to see how this treatment that we put on the car is going to hold up to this kind of abuse. Supposedly, it's going to make the car a lot easier to clean and maybe even prevent it from getting as dirty to begin with, but I've got my doubts about that. I've had some pretty dirty cars out here, and I'm really curious to see how this one stacks up. This Punisher 4 is a lot of fun. It's pretty easy to control, especially even out in this really wet, sloppy dirt. And I'm having a lot of fun with this thing. I really think they need to add a 15-tooth pinion out of the box. I understand this thing's designed to be for beginners, which is why they only have a 13-tooth pinion, but a 15-tooth pinion would give it a little bit more pep, and I think it would make it a lot more appealing to people. It's pretty easy to put a 15-tooth pinion on it, but still, having that 13-tooth pinion on there out of the box really does hold the truck back. Even though in small areas like this, it's actually not too bad. But once you get out into bigger open areas, the low top speed definitely is a hindrance. I still think this is one of the best cars you can get in the large 1/10 scale category though. This basically has all 1/8 scale driveline components, and it really does handle very well out of the box. Team Corrali is known for their handling, and I think the body on the Punisher 4 actually looks better than the one on the Kagama 4, but this one's looking pretty filthy, and we're not going to clean it right now. No, we're going to let this thing dry just the way it is. While that's marinating, we need to talk about the thing you'll probably spend the most time doing, and that's ongoing maintenance. These trucks are subject to a lot of abuse, and again, keeping them well maintained is going to keep you out bashing and save you money. After a bash, the lines between maintenance and repair are probably going to get blurred because the things you have to fix and the things you have to pay attention to make sure you don't have to fix them are probably going to be pretty similar. For instance, I need to replace this rear body mount. This is a repair, but if I didn't do it, it would cause more problems, so it's also kind of maintenance. I also noticed that this rear hex extender is loose. This would be a maintenance thing because I don't actually have to replace anything, but again, those lines get blurred. Obviously, the maintenance you have to do is going to be different for every vehicle, but the most important thing is to give your car a good once-over after each bash session. I like to cycle the suspension. This gives you a good idea if there's anything broken up here in the front and in the rear. Especially if you do this frequently, you're going to get to know what it should feel like, and when it stops feeling like that, then you know there's something you need to take a look at. Same thing goes for the steering. Just run the steering back and forth. If there's any tight spots, then obviously there's something that needs to be worked on there. If the servo sounds weird, you might need to address the servo. And if you feel anything that's loose, that might mean something's coming apart. And it's good to just roll the RC back and forth. If you feel any tight spots, anything crunching or grinding, that could mean there's something wrong in the drivetrain. And again, if you can address these things early, it can save you time and money in the long run. Another thing to pay attention to are your fans. Make sure they're clear of debris and that they're running smoothly. It can sometimes be hard to notice if one of these fans fails, but if it does fail, it could end up costing you your electronics if you don't get them replaced quickly enough. Another maintenance item that some people might not think about are the connectors for your batteries. These pins in here can get squished together over time, and you might find that your connectors are really easy to plug in and unplug. If this happens, they can fall out during bashing, and if they partially fall out, that can cause a high resistance situation, which can again damage your electronics. If you find your connectors are getting a little loose, you can take something that fits in the middle of the pin and just sort of gently roll it around in the pins to spread them out. Do this a little bit at a time so you can get the proper tension. You want them to be pretty tight to push together, but not so tight that they're impossible to pull back apart again. Another maintenance item that can sometimes get overlooked is your body. As you can see here, this body has a crack in it, and whereas fixing this could be considered repair, not maintenance, this kind of thing happens often enough that it probably does fall under maintenance as well. There's a lot of different options for something like this. You can just tape it. You can do cement board tape in E6000, or of course you could replace the body. Just keep in mind, if you don't address these sorts of issues early, they're going to get pretty bad pretty quickly, and then you will be replacing your body. And finally, you just want to give everything on the car a good once-over. Take a look at all of your wiring, make sure everything's still plugged in the way it's supposed to be. Look at your battery straps, make sure they aren't frayed or badly damaged. Inspect any of the drivetrain components that you can see, make sure there's no rocks or debris in here that's going to damage anything. And then finally, take a look at all your plastics and your screws. Make sure nothing's backing out, make sure nothing's cracked. If you catch this stuff early, again, it's going to save you time and money in the long run. Now let's go get that Punisher 4 cleaned up, and then I'll tell you what I think about regularly scheduled maintenance, and you might be surprised about my opinion on that. As you can see here, the car is absolutely filthy, and the first thing we're going to try is blowing it off with this Cow RC turbo blower. This thing is extremely powerful and really does move a lot of air. It's not the cheapest thing in the world, but short of a really big air compressor, this is probably your best choice for blowing off dirt and debris from an RC car. Just after blowing this off, there's a very clear difference between the side that was treated and the side that wasn't. I'm actually pretty surprised. You can see a little bit of it on the body, but the real difference comes underneath. Look at the rear arm on the right-hand side that was treated versus the rear arm on the left-hand side that wasn't. The dirt is really stuck over here, and there's basically no dirt left over here. Obviously, it's not perfect though, and blowing the car off is never going to get the car perfectly clean. That's where washing's going to come in. Before you put water to your car, there are some things you need to keep in mind. First of all, you need to make sure your car is waterproof. Most of the electronics on this car are, however, this radio box is not. Another thing to keep in mind is if you haven't vented your tires, water's probably going to get in your wheels and it's going to get stuck in there. And then finally, it's important to understand that when you wash your car, you're going to be pushing some of that dirt and water into places that you probably aren't going to want it to be, such as in your bearings. things. That being said, let's go ahead and get this thing washed off and then see what it looks like. And to do this, I'm just gonna take a high pressure nozzle and spray everything off. Obviously, again, if you've got electronics that aren't waterproof, you're gonna want to avoid those. But then once you're done, blow it off with compressed air, whatever kind of compressed air option you have. And then most importantly, I like to put it in front of a fan to finish drying. This gets all the water out of those little nooks and crannies and really helps prevent things from getting rusty. Before we talk about routine maintenance, I want to say I'm really impressed with this silicone spray. As you can see on the body here, it's actually quite a bit cleaner on the treated side than on the untreated side. We had some dirt stick to it here and no dirt stick to it here. This is a really impressive result. Underneath, it's not quite as obvious, but if you look closely, whereas both sides got fairly clean, there's still quite a bit of residue on the untreated side and basically no residue on the treated side. Now, obviously, just hosing the car off isn't going to get it perfectly clean, and there are things you can do such as using RC car wash cleaners, brushes, etc. to get them really, really clean. But generally speaking, I think just hosing them off, blowing them off with compressed air, and then putting them in front of a fan to finish drying is going to get your car as clean as you need it to 99% of the time, especially for bashing. Now let's talk about routine maintenance. In your manual, no matter what car you have, it's going to talk about maintaining specific parts of your car on some sort of set schedule. Personally, I don't do any of that. If you're driving a race car, obviously you're going to be taking things apart, adjusting things, tuning things, replacing fluids, etc., all the time. But with a basher, other than the inspections I talked about earlier and fixing things as you find them, I don't really see any need to go in and do a bunch of maintenance on things on a regular schedule. Of course, you can go in every 10 or 20 packs and take your shocks apart, take your differentials apart, replace all the fluid in them, clean them up, and do all that, but I personally never really do those things. At least with the type of bashing I do, I find things break often enough that just doing maintenance while you're in there tends to be good enough. Obviously, this is just my personal opinion, and following the manufacturer's recommendations is always what's going to be best. But ultimately, if you're a basher, these RC cars are toys, and I think it's more important to go out there and have fun than to be constantly concerned about making sure everything is absolutely perfect. Of course, if you find making everything perfect all the time to be fun, there's nothing wrong with that. There's no wrong way to enjoy this hobby. If you're the kind of person that takes the car out of the box and just thrashes it, never cleans it, and only fixes it when it finally stops moving, that's cool. If you're the kind of person that polishes every single little part of your car after every single run, that's also cool. Speaking of cool, I'm going to be doing my wildest upgrade ever using this V6 Creighton EXB. Definitely make sure you get subscribed if you don't want to miss that. And while you're at it, if you haven't seen my review of this car, check it out here.